ناقصات عقل ودين is probably one of those hadith that is so awfully misused and misquoted for very sad reasons. But whatever those reasons are, I am here today to hopefully teach you something about this hadith that will change the way that you see this hadith. And in general, as a rule of thumb, anyone who misuses Quran or hadith and misquotes it and misinterprets it in a way that fits their personal agenda is doing injustice to the words of Allah and the words of the Prophet ﷺ. So we're going to go slowly over this. This is a long video. It's not going to fit on Instagram, but the full-length video is going to be on YouTube. If this has ever been something that has intrigued you to understand what this hadith means, the context of it, and I would encourage you to go watch that hadith and share it with any woman, because our deen is beautiful and Allah is just, and the Prophet ﷺ does not ever say anything that would contradict the reality, al-waqa, or the truth and the Quran. So if we ever read something or we hear something and we perceive it to be something that is severely unjust, then it is on us to do research to understand the context of that hadith or that Quran verse, so that we can apply it better. We have a beautiful traditional way of studying our deen. It is not left up. Google is great and AI is great, but we already know that, there's very limited resources on Google, but also AI is, a lot of times AI is actually incorrect. AI will make up verses and will make up a hadith. But also we have the traditional way of studying, which is knee to knee when it comes to teachers and students, that has been passed down for generations and is the most accurate to date, because information is being passed directly from the teacher to the student. It allows less room for misinterpretation and fabrication, given, of course, that this teacher is one to be sound and intellectual and has actually studied the deen under their own teachers as well. And my teachers usually tell us this, is that before you study, find out who the teachers of your teachers are, because it makes a difference. And if you can't track down someone to one specific teacher, then there's a huge gap that is questionable there, because most of the usuli studies and the traditional ways of studying, you can track each student to who their teacher was, and that establishes authenticity to what they're saying. And so this past year, our studies in hadith discussed this specific hadith, and it was actually really interesting, because my teacher, we got to this hadith and he looked at us and he said, we're going to wait till next class to study this hadith, because it's so packed, it's so filled. And he said he actually assigned further reading that was required for us to do, and he said, I want you next time to come back with a whole page of questions, because he knew that this was such a misquoted and misused hadith, and instantly he knew that there were questions that were going to come up. So he said, there's extra reading that we have to do that explains this hadith, and then we will discuss it together as a class. So today I'm actually going to be using a few resources. The first of those is Mishkat al-Masabih, which is the outlining of the hadith. But then there's also another book that is called the Mirqat, which is an explanation of the Mafatih by Mullah Ali Qari. So I will be using that as well. I will be using my notes from my class, from my teacher explanation, and then I will also be using تحرير المرأة في عصر الرسالة to further break down. You can tell here my notes. I love my sticky notes. There is some ground leveling that we have to do before we begin to establish a foundation to what we're about to discuss, and that is, in general, hadith studies. Like we said, there's an entire science of hadith. When we discuss historical events, we usually discuss so much that goes on in a history event, the context of it, what was said in detail, the back and forth. I mean, even when, a child comes up to their mom and says, so-and-so did this to me, did that, the mom's going to ask, well, what was happening before, and what was said during, and what was said after. And so there's this entire context that is built around understanding narrations, understanding historical events. But sometimes we forget that when we're studying hadith, and we like to take words as is, and there is, that's a hard concept to live by, because there's context to everything being said. So that's one important fact to kind of just, level on. It's really my hope that we give the same level of attention to detail and context that we do to historical events, to science, to all these other different studies that we give that same level to hadith and to the deen. The next thing is that the Prophet will never say anything that contradicts reality. So the Prophet is al-waqa, what we are living. The Prophet is, or even something that would contradict to the Quran. So when Allah mentions in the Quran that, men are like women, women are like men, the only thing that differentiates them is their level of taqwa. The Prophet is not going to come and say something that is otherwise. And if we read something that is this is what we understand from it, then this is kind of a lack of nuqsan on our part. And I use the word nuqsan, deficiency, purposely here because it's going to come up later as well. The other thing is that the Muslim world was under colonization for a very long time. It's just those years were focused on dismantling the madrasas, dismantling the education system in the Muslim world and rebuilding it in a way that fits the colonizer and their agenda. And so a lot of time, a lot of things fell through the cracks during that time. And one of those things that we need to revive as an ummah is better understanding our history. And because of that, a lot of things were misquoted, misinterpreted, used to fit various agendas over others. So that's important to remember when you're studying the deen as well. And then number 4, even with deen studies, it's so important the teacher that you take studies from, that they are qualified in this specific specialty. So every hadith teacher is not necessarily someone who is well versed in fiqh and vice versa. And it's Yusuf Sheikh Yusuf Qaradawi has in Tahrir al-Mara, in this book Tahrir al-Mara fi Asr Risala, he says something really funny, and he says بعض الناس قد يكون إماما في علم من العلوم, that some people might be a scholar in one علم, in one specialty over the other, but ولكنه في علم آخر عامي أو شبه عامي, but they are in something else. And he names a really famous scholar, and he says this scholar is great in this part of the studies, but he's blind in this other study, so I can't really study this specific topic under him, even though he's such a well-known scholar, very reputable, but he was just really good in one aspect of studies. And so Yusuf al-Qaradawi is saying, why are people taking explanation from him? And it's the same thing in our world. If you want to, you're not going to go to an OBGYN for a problem with your feet, or you're not going to go to an eye doctor because, to take a look at your heart problems. But this is how we're treating the deen. We're kind of just lumping everyone in, like a sheikh or sheikha all of a sudden is well versed to speak on very critical things like fiqh and hadith, and that's a nuqsan on our part. That's a deficiency on our part, that we haven't done due diligence in who and how we get our information. The Prophet ﷺ begins by addressing the women. In the context of this, we're going to discuss 2 things. Context, which is al-munasaba, and then the manner in which it was addressed. So that's more like of a sigha, that it was addressing the women. And so first of all, the context of this, I smile because when you understand how this, or when you can imagine or picture what's going on here as women, it's actually really funny. So the Prophet ﷺ approaches a group of women, and this is Salat al-Eid. So this is after Salat al-Eid. It's as if the women haven't heard, or they were sitting too far back, or he's just approaching them to speak directly to the women and give them the attention. So he goes to a group of Ansar, and it's important that we note these details in context, because context is key. Context is important. So he's approaching women from the Ansar, the people of Medina, and he is addressing them directly. And he says, يا معشر النساء, oh women. And he said, ما رأيت من ناقصات عقل ودين أذهب للب الرجل الحازم من إحداكن. And the part that is usually misquoted or misused is ناقصات عقل ودين. And what that can roughly and loosely translate to in English is that deficient in intellect, even though aql is far more than intellect, and deen. And so of course you can imagine why words in this hadith can, for women who don't understand, or who this hadith is used and weaponized against them, these words can be very jarring and worrisome. So we're going to break it down. So this hadith won't become an issue for you anymore. And so he's approaching women. Now, why is it important for us to understand who the Prophet is talking to? Is because women of the Ansar, they were like the women of the city versus women that were coming from Mecca. And, if you live in the States, it's like, women of the South versus women of the North. We always talk about women of the South to be these like really strong, bootstrapped women who are holding the fort down and there's certain character element to women of the South versus women of the North. So it's very similar to how the women of Medina were versus the women of Mecca. So there were instances where the women of Mecca, women of Medina were very vocal and outspoken. And this is not like in a disrespectful way, but it was something that the men of Mecca and the women of Mecca were not used to. So it's more of like having a lead or a say over what their husband is saying or doing. So one time, the wife of Umar ibn al-Khattab also was very vocal and outspoken. He was, questioning like, why are you talking to me like this? And he says, well, all the women of Mecca, all the women of Medina are speaking the same way. Or she goes and tells him that Hafsa, your own daughter, is speaking to the Prophet like this. So what it was is that Umar ibn al-Khattab was commenting on how the women of Mecca, who al-Muhajirin, started adopting so much from the ways of the women of the Ansar. So the Prophet is speaking to the women of Ansar. So what is he telling them? He said, ما رأيت من ناقصات عقل ودين أذهب للب الرجل. Now, I'm going to define two terms for you right now. The word aql and the word lub, because you might find them in English being defined as the same thing, but what a grave injustice that is. So aql is intellect, it's knowledge, but it's also like reason and discernment. And there is so much more context to it, al-aql. Al-lub is like a more refined version of the aql. It's like very like pure intellect. It is, someone that is grounded, intellectual, and wise. So although I guess the way that we can put it is that every aql is a lub, but every lub is not a aql. So a lub is a more specific term, but aql is kind of more widely used. And the reason this matters is because the Prophet says, naqs is a very interesting word. And if you remember from the beginning of this video, I said if there is ever if we ever read something and we think it sounds wrong or unjust from what the Prophet or even the words in the Quran, that is nuqsan from our part, is a deficiency from our part. And I use that word purposely there because someone who misunderstands something does not make them inferior, or someone who is deficient in a specific topic or a specific skill or responsibility does not make them inferior as a personality. And let me give you an example. Men can't give birth. Men can't have babies. They are deficient in this specific skill, in this specific, that doesn't make them inferior. That deficiency is replaced with other qualities and other characteristics in life. And so when we say that women or that you are deficient or I am deficient in something specific, a specific knowledge, it doesn't make that inferior. Let me give you another example. An architect is deficient in knowledge on medicine. That doesn't make one more superior than the other. And someone who is in the medical field is probably deficient on architecture as well and doesn't know 2 cents about how to build the foundation of a home. It just makes them different in knowledge and skill sets and characteristics. And so we have to acknowledge that biological difference between men and women, character-wise, skill-wise, and Allah's not saying, or the Prophet is not saying, one is superior to the other. So not because a man can't give birth, it makes him inferior or deficient as a general characteristic. But that is just being replaced by something else, other qualities and responsibilities that a man might have. And the same applies to a woman. And let me see, I want to see if you can pick up now on what it means. ما رأيت من ناقصات عقل ودين أذهب للب الرجل الحازم من إحداكن. But I think there's something that I have to explain first. ناقصات عقل ودين, what that is. So one woman actually, and that was the woman of Ansar again. One woman asked the Prophet, what do you mean ناقصات عقل ودين? What is that, what is that referring to? And so he says ناقصات عقل is that when the testimony of a woman is half that testimony of a man. This is an entirely other story. Again, there is a whole other explanation to that. It is not, there are exceptions to that rule as well. There are women where, there are instances where the testimony of one woman has counted. Again, that is separate topic, whether you understand that part fully or not. We can do a separate video for that. So he's saying that's where, the deficiency comes in. And then for naqasat deen is that when a woman is in her hayd or is not praying during her menstruation cycle, that is what the Prophet is saying, referring to when he says naqasat deen. And it's not a matter of inferiority. It's just simply stating the facts that there is a deficiency there when you are not praying, when you are on your menstruation cycle. It is a way of Allah taking something off of your chest, one load, because your body is busy doing something else. So it is more a means of a rahmah, but it is not to say that women are inferior to men just because they have a period. Just like it's not inferior, a man does not become inferior just because he can't carry children. Again, very similar topics. So now the Prophet, I want to read the whole thing to you. ما رأيت من ناقصات عقل ودين أذهب لرب الرجل الحازم من إحداكن. I have not seen someone who has this deficiency in their aql and deen, who is capable of taking over and overpowering a man's lubb, which we mentioned to be like the khalis, the pure intellect of a man, like a woman, like one of you. Now, I don't know about you, but that doesn't sound like a statement of inferiority. That sounds more like of an amazement. Let me give you an example. It sounds more of like a paradox, and it is. Let me give you an example. When we say children are weak, but have you ever seen the power? I have never seen a child, something so powerful that can take over the heart and the mind of a parent, like a newborn child or like their baby's cry. That is not saying that the babies are bad. It's not saying that those children are bad because, they are weak, so they're overpowering their parents. That is more of like a statement of amazement. It is a paradox to say that children are weak. Children in that time, relatively, it doesn't mean that children are inferior. And so the Prophet, it's not, again, a general statement. It's not a blanket statement. Are there children that are smarter and more intellectual than adults? Absolutely. So this is not a blanket. It's not like a qaida. It's not a qaida amma. It's not a rule of thumb here. Oh, women are inferior to men, or men are inferior to women, and children are inferior to adults. And that's not what it is. It's more of like a paradox. So this is being said in the same way. This is a praise. This is a statement of amazement from the Prophet towards women. And let me remind you that this is being said during Eid. This is not, the Prophet was about to give them a piece. There is a piece of advice that comes after that about the importance of giving zakah, of giving sadaqah and charity. But this is during Eid. If you are going to have like a small halaqah or a small chit chat during such a fun, exciting event, there's going to be some mulatafa. There's going to be some joking. There's going to be some, when you sit with someone in a group, imagine a group of women, of men sitting in a halaqah, and the sheikh says, you're probably all, I don't know how you all got away from your homes right now, or your phones must be blowing up if you stay an extra 5 minutes. That's not to say their wives are these evil people. It's just a way of mulatafa. It's a way of joking around and being lighthearted. And the Prophet ﷺ was known to do that with women before giving advice. So it's not all about like rules and boundaries and restrictions. There was this sense of lightheartedness to how he gave advice. So I hope that explains things a little bit. I hope that explains that this is far from what we think it is. There's definitely pages and pages of explanation to this. I don't know that all the information is really for like general consumption, but I hope that this amount of information helps you better understand that this hadith was more of a compliment, I think, to women than it is a matter of deficiency. If this hadith was ever used as a way of demeaning you, I'm so sorry. That's not how the deen should be. But I hope that you know your deen a little bit better now. I think something else that's really important is that depending on where you live around the world and what you speak, the language that you speak actually, in English in general, we tend to be a lot more sensitive overly sensitive to what is being said, because that's kind of the language that we use. It's very limited. Versus so feelings, emotions, communications, we're very limited by our vocabulary. Versus when you look at children who are raised around other languages with a deeper sense of communication and vocabulary, you'll see that they have such better explanation and words to describe this, to describe various scenarios. And so it's really important when you are studying the deen, when you are studying rules and regulations, I'm sure the same applies, and whatnot, for there not to be an over sense of sensitivity. Islam, the rules and regulations that are in place are meant to be established as a general moral and communal baseline. It is not meant, now there are exceptions, and why such a rule in place? So again, qawaid and ahkam is not established with the exception in mind. It's established with a society of generations that have passed and generations to come. Again, a general moral and communal baseline. And under that now comes exceptions that where rulings, various rulings are addressed